Today, we're happy to have Matthew T. Huber here. Huber is professor of geography in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He's the author of Lifeblood, Oil, Freedom, and Forces of Capital, and Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet, which we'll hear about today, as well as articles in Jacobin and Catalyst. I'm glad that you all came, and special thanks to Matthew Huber for coming tonight. I hope you all have a nice Friday evening with this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to the association for having me. I'm very excited. I actually have this book in my physical possession this week for the first time, so I'm really excited to talk about it, and I'm hoping to give this a version of this presentation in several venues, so I'd really appreciate feedback on what doesn't make sense and so forth. But let me try to share my screen so you don't have to look at me this whole time. Okay. So in the year 2020, it seemed like things would be different. During yet another catastrophic fire season, record heat and storms, the US elected a president with the most ambitious climate plan of any candidate in history. His plan was shaped directly by climate activists, most notably the Sunrise Movement, and the architect of the Green New Deal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And upon taking office, Joe Biden pledged what he called a whole of government approach to the climate crisis and proposed to slash greenhouse gas emissions by 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. Meanwhile, the financial and corporate world seemed to be getting smart on climate. Asset managers like BlackRock promoted a new investment regime meant to take the risks, financial and planetary, of climate change into account under the banner of environment, social governance investing, ESG. And even many of the oil and gas giants promised to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Yet here we are in 2022, and it's clear it's all gone horribly awry. Boom times have returned to the fossil fuel industry. In the spring of 2021, the New York Times noted skyrocketing stock prices for oil and gas firms amid a surging recovery from the COVID pandemic. By early 2022, oil and gas firms were reporting their best profits in nearly a decade, and production was surging around the world. And it wasn't just oil and gas. Coal, the dirtiest of fossil fuels, has also seen prices and profits surge. The Financial Times reported in March that the global surge in demand has delivered windfall profits for companies such as Glencore, Whitehaven Coal, and Peabody Energy. Peabody is the largest private coal company on the planet, and in February, they posted a quarterly profit that was almost triple of what analysts expected, and revenue surged 72% from a year ago to 1.26 billion. And of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the uncertainty around the supplies of Russian oil and gas have only exacerbated the turn to coal and the surging prices of oil and gas. So what can we make of this apparent impasse of fossil fuel production gone wild alongside cascading climate disaster? I'm afraid it seems we've reached another cycle, the end of another cycle of hope, disappointment, and finally despair and resignation. The first such cycle actually crested around the 2008 financial crisis and the debacle that happened in Copenhagen in 2009. And here we are in 2022, and it's very clear we're still losing this climate fight. So I would argue that our problem can be boiled down to this: those that benefit from the production and consumption of fossil fuels will continue to do so unless society forces them to stop. And as I will explain below, this is fundamentally a class problem. For decades, climate policy experts have told us we can solve climate change without confronting the power of those who own and control the production of energy. With clever market incentives like carbon taxes or cap and trade, we can simply nudge the market toward a clean energy transition. Now, as you can see here, the Biden administration has simply doubled down on this idea that we can trust the private sector to solve this for us. Yet I would argue it should be clear by now that we're not going to solve this massive crisis through markets or through getting the prices right. And the solution to climate change requires a much more massive political and material intervention in how society produces energy. Again, this is fundamentally a class problem. It's a problem of who owns and controls our energy system and to what end. Thus, it will require a class struggle to solve. So in this talk, I'll give my book's overview of the three basic classes at the core of climate politics today. I argue the capitalist class is the one responsible for the crisis. The professional class is the one driving climate policy advocacy and political activity. And the working class has both the power of numbers as the majority of society and the strategic capacity to shape the energy transition itself through labor and union organizing in that very energy sector. The core argument I'm trying to make is this: to take on this entrenched power of the first of these classes, the capitalists who control our energy system, we really need a mass movement that appeals to the vast majority of society in the working class. So ultimately, I argue we need to build a much more popular and majoritarian or democratic approach to climate politics. And I argue that the professional class form of climate advocacy is uniquely ill-equipped to deliver this kind of popular climate politics. Before I get into the bulk of the talk, I want to give a note about the method I employed in this book. And I want to be upfront that I wrote this book really from a standpoint of tremendous anger. I'd recently become a parent of a beautiful young human named Loretta in 2015. And I really want the planet to be safe for her in 2080 when she reaches retirement age. But I also was noting in 2015 that Obama was nearing the end of his 2 terms that concluded with almost next to nothing achieved on climate. And meanwhile, we have known for decades about the seriousness of the climate crisis, yet the climate movement has really not proven to have any ability to build the kind of social force capable of addressing the problem. So much of this book is really meant to be a ruthless critique of everything existing in the climate movement today, because we're not winning this fight. And we need more introspection as to why. And too often in the climate advocacy community, I see a lot of people talking to each other, saying the same things, patting each other on the back about how brilliant and smart everyone is. And we're not really questioning why our policies, our strategies are not working and how they might. So I absolutely do not have the arrogance to believe I have all the answers, but I do think we need to be more reflexive, self-critical, and offer actually alternative strategies and pathways towards winning this fight. And that's what I'm trying to do in this book. So with that note on method out of the way, I want to take a deeper dive into how we understand this idea of class and how it shapes our thinking on climate politics. So the idea that climate change is a problem of class inequality has attracted wide attention as of late. In 2015, Oxfam released this infamous report entitled Extreme Carbon Inequality that found that the top 10% of people in the world are responsible for 50% of emissions, while the bottom 50% are only responsible for 10%. And as you can see in the figure, these emissions are attached to something called lifestyle consumption emissions. The same year, economists Thomas Piketty and Lucas Chanel crunched the data to reveal similarly stark numbers. The top 10% of emitters, according to them, contributed to 45% of global emissions. Just last year, a new study found that the wealthy, who they identify as the polluter elite, are, quote, at the heart of the climate problem. And the study recommends, quote, far-reaching changes in lifestyle are also required if we are to avoid dangerous levels of global heating. Such proposals can get even more specific. In 2018, a widely cited study compared different lifestyle actions one can take to limit their climate impact and found one choice more important than all others, which is having children. And they did a little life cycle emission analysis on your choice to love and cherish a child and found that that is the most emission intensive thing you can do, even worse than driving a car, flying a lot, eating meat, having kids was what they found. Now, I'm aiming to critique all these studies. They all share two fundamental assumptions. First, they assume class inequality is fundamentally based on one's income and, above all, consumption and lifestyle practices. Second, and more perniciously, they link emissions and thus carbon responsibility to those same consumption and lifestyle practices. This linkage is based on the method of carbon footprint accounting, a metric that allows anyone to input their consumption practices, the car they drive, the meat they eat, the children they decide to rear, into a calculator which can precisely determine how many pounds of carbon they emit a year. So this linking of emissions and the inequality of carbon-based footprints is so entrenched amongst policy analysts, journalists, that it's rarely questioned. And it's got an attractive sort of progressive analysis of inequality. And it has another appeal that it makes all of us humans on the planet accountable for the resources and energy we consume in our daily lives, and thus gives us meaningful choices over how to change our behavior to aid climate action. But all humans really don't have equal control over resources in a capitalist system, which is what class is supposed to explain. I would argue carbon footprint thinking is a highly ideological mystification of capitalist social relations. By placing responsibility for emissions solely on consumers, it ultimately assumes the economy is driven by the choices of consumers. Now, this is a theory of consumer sovereignty that's ultimately rooted in mainstream neoclassical economics and neoliberal ideology that suggests it's really consumer demand that drives the economy. It would have us believe that dispersed consumers have all the power in the economy, and it's not really in the hands of concentrated corporations who control production. Moreover, there are ways of thinking about class that do not focus primarily on your income or on your consumption or on your lifestyle choices. Obviously, a more traditional socialist understanding of class centers not on consumption at all, but on production. Class is defined as your relationship to the means of production. And we don't often think about it as much, but understanding class in terms of your relationship to production is a highly ecological way of thinking about class. We really don't live as humans, as ecological beings, unless we produce the means of subsistence, the means of life. Thus, from this perspective, those who have the power over the production of our food, energy, of housing, and other key necessities to life actually have immense social power. And it's quite easy to see how these classes who control these things would have a material interest in blocking climate action. It's also equally clear in a capitalist system from this point of view that the working class, those that really own nothing but their labor power to sell for a wage on the market, have very little power over the organization of our carbon-intensive system of production. In an ecological sense, the working class is profoundly alienated from the production of their food, energy, transportation, and other means of life. When we simply shift our class analytic to this lens, focused on production, we come to strikingly different conclusions about inequality and climate responsibility. First, we could point out that the entire idea of a carbon footprint was itself concocted by the industry that profits off fossil fuels in the first place. A recent study found that ExxonMobil in their advertisements have systematically, quote, worked to shift responsibility for global warming away from the fossil fuel industry and onto consumers. The article recounts the origins of the carbon footprint concept. The quote, the very notion of a personal carbon footprint was popularized by in 2004-2006 by the oil firm BP as part of a $100 million per year beyond petroleum US media campaign that predated the horrific Deepwater Horizon oil spill. There we go. Second, we should understand every carbon footprint is not an isolated individual, but actually a web of relations wrapped up in the production of those consumers and their carbon footprints. When you drive a car and emit carbon, the gasoline in your tank flowed through the hands of innumerable people seeking profit under capitalism. Oil exploration consultants, rig service firms, pipeline companies, gas station operators, yet you are the one wholly responsible, 100% responsible for the footprint simply because you pressed the accelerator leading to the emissions. When it comes to consumption, every commodity sold has users and profiteers along the chain. And I argue we really should place the bulk of responsibility on these people profiting from production, not simply people fulfilling their needs in the realm of consumption. And this is not really a moral calculus as much as an objective assessment of who has the power along these commodity chains. Of course, we don't want to completely ignore the responsibility of those few wealthy consumers who buy fuel inefficient cars, who eat steak twice a week and fly excessively. But the question I want to raise is, why do we only focus on consumption as the proper zone of responsibility in politics and carbon inequality or whatever else? The third point I want to make is that when we only focus on an individual's rich lifestyle, we ignore how they became rich in the first place. And as it happens, that activity, getting rich, might have a much more significant climate impact. So let's take an example. We got this guy here. He's a CEO of a chemical company, Dow Chemical. Now we can imagine that this guy spends 8 to 12 hours a day to help organize a global network of chemical factories that emit millions of tons of carbon dioxide per year. And as CEO, their income and stock options are primarily derived from this activity, planning, expanding chemical production for profit as a commodity for sale. Now imagine this guy goes home in an SUV and eats steak for dinner. Now, why do we only focus on that activity when we talk about carbon inequality? Surely the SUV and the steak are drops in the bucket compared to his everyday role as a titan of chemical capital. Here again, if we subject this activity of production for profit to carbon accounting, we find that the main culprits in the climate crisis aren't simply rich consumers. Rather, it's a class of owners who control and profit from the production of aviation, of automobiles, of steel, chemicals, and other carbon-intensive sectors of capital. And also, if you just look at the basic data, this is from 2014 actually, but if you break down the emissions by sector, you can see that production, the industrial sector of production, is the overall the most culpable in emissions. This is where a lot of the emissions that we don't see in our everyday lives are happening, in this industrial production of steel, of cement, of all this kind of stuff. And if you add those two up, the indirect emissions are from the consumption of electricity by these industrial actors. You get that they're responsible together for about a third, 32%. Okay. So it's worth pointing out that these individuals, capitalist owners, are not like you and me. They're not trying to lessen their carbon footprint and do their part to save the planet. They are narrowly seeking profit in a globally competitive market that makes it cost effective and profitable to continue to burn fossil fuel. So in the book, I actually review some of my own research on a really carbon intensive sector of the nitrogen fertilizer industry, which is responsible for roughly around 2.5% of global carbon emissions. So I actually had an opportunity to talk to the leaders in this industry, and I was really stunned to just find the remarkable level of indifference to their substantial carbon problem. When I asked them if they had pondered alternatives to their main input and source of emissions, which is natural gas, they actually excitedly said they had thought about alternatives. Only it was in the early 2000s when natural gas prices spiked, similar to today actually. And during this high price period of their main input, a lot of fertilizer plants were shuttered around the country. And the people at the facility I was talking to said they were actually on the verge of thinking about converting their nitrogen facilities to use coal or something called pet coke, which are probably the dirtiest and most carbon-intensive feedstocks for nitrogen that you could ever imagine. And yet this conversion from natural gas to coal and petcoke was, for them, seen as possibly a very logical and profitable choice in their attempt to survive a globally competitive fertilizer market. This analysis, when we focus on the owners of production as being most responsible, it actually clarifies our political task. Instead of a moral project to convert the lifestyles of billions of dispersed consumers, we face perhaps harder, but also more straightforward political project to erode the power of the class who controls and profits from the production of emissions and emission-intensive activities. So this was the first part of the argument of the book. Focus on production, focus on ownership, focus on profit, and focus on the capitalist class that does all these things. Now, the second part of the book focuses on who drives climate politics, the professional class. This class is made up of credentialed degree holders like journalists, scientists, academics, and NGO staffers who are at the core of climate advocacy. This class also happens to be the class most invested in this kind of moral politics of lifestyle choices and lowering your carbon footprint and all that stuff. So what is the professional class? It is complicated. I actually proposed, I wrote the proposal for this book in 2017, and in the interim 5 years, as many of you probably know, this debate over the concept of the professional managerial classes really exploded and created all sorts of divisions amongst leftists, and that wasn't the case when I proposed this book. But obviously, I do draw a lot on this concept, though. The professional managerial class, a term coined by Barbara and John Ehrenreich in the 1970s. And they were really trying to grapple with the sort of disproportionate share of new left activists that were coming from this kind of newly expanding cadres of professional college-educated milieus. So there's a lot in the book about this class, but I want to kind of make a few points, 4 points to start off. First, some four key points to really understand the nature of professional class climate politics. First, the material project of the professional class is about marshaling credentials, things like degrees and licenses, that ultimately carve out advantages in a highly unequal capitalist labor market. The focus on educational attainment means the professional class is also extremely ideologically connected to ideas of meritocracy and tends to sort of equate one's own material position with knowledge, hard work, and smarts, and the rest of it. Second, the professional class project is ultimately really one aimed toward achieving a nominal level of autonomy in the professional workplace, but more importantly, attaining this kind of middle class level of material security, a comfortable level of consumption in the United States. This often is connected with home and automobile ownership and the rest of that. Third, and perhaps most crucially, the professional class is really a small minority of society as a whole. You can see this is from Kim Moody's book, and it's just a rough estimate, but he estimates that 22% of the workforce in the United States is in this so-called professional class, a huge amount of which are, as he says, proletarianizing, which we can all recognize, and which these are the kind of ranks of a lot of socialist organizations in the United States. But you know, it's, if you just think about it for a minute, that over 60, you know, roughly around 63% of Americans really lack a bachelor's degree, lack a college degree. And you can immediately conclude that this class of degree holders, of professionals, we're not talking about a majoritarian basis for any kind of political movement. And of course, this does connect especially since 2020, commentators like Thomas Piketty again and David Shore have pointed out that there's this large-scale process happening of educational polarization, wherein left parties and center-left parties that were once parties of the working class have shifted increasingly to these affluent and highly educated professional constituencies. Now, a few have linked this to climate politics in that it's these same kind of minoritarian factions who are concerned and active on climate change. Now, the fourth point is thinking of our definition of class as related to the means of production. The professional class is a class that is profoundly separated from material production and largely confined to what we often call the knowledge economy or cognitive capitalism or whatever you want to say. And the rise of the professional class paralleled the decline of the kind of industrial working class in the global north. And with it, obviously, a powerful form of mass politics that really had become a proven, capable form of confronting the substantial power of capital. So now I'd like to say a couple things about professional class climate politics. First, professional class climate politics is deeply invested in the politics of knowledge, a politics of the belief or denial in science. Now you can think of the March for Science in the Trump years as perhaps a mass action of the professional class. It's not only that environmental activists are themselves scientific experts, they often are. It's also that this class politics is probably most offended by science denial, misinformation, a war on facts, and this kind of this discourse of post-truth in the Trump years was all the rage in this milieu. Second, because of their relative material comfort, professional class environmental politics is rooted in anxiety around their own consumption, or what I describe in one chapter as carbon guilt. At the core of professional class politics is a contradiction. I mean, it's based upon using your credentials to attain this economic security, but the forms of consumption attached to that security, things like single-family homes and car ownership and professional expectations of air travel, these create tremendous feelings of ecological complicity while the world is burning. So this overwhelming feeling, the overwhelming feeling leads to this idea that these professionals are themselves the core drivers of climate change and climate breakdown. And it's not really the owners of production that we detailed in the previous section. And this belief stems from a wider discourse that some scholars have referred to as sort of this ecological privilege, where middle-class consumers are actively the ones destroying the planet. So now I'm going to review this highly schematic 3 types of professional class climate politics that I identify in the book. This is just a very rudimentary typology. I will also explain how each of these types espouses a climate politics that's really inherently antagonistic to the majority of working class people in our highly unequal and barbaric form of capitalism, particularly in the United States, which much of the book kind of focuses on. I do want to be clear, though, there's no inherent problem with professional class people doing environmental politics, doing climate politics, doing socialist politics. In fact, all of socialist history always has these stratum as major shapers of working class movements and socialist movements. But if professional class politics is, again, actively antagonistic to the masses of working people, that's a problem that I want to identify. So the first type is what I call the science communicators, who are either natural scientists or otherwise deeply invested in knowing what the science says, like environmental journalists. This type of person believes the primary problem in environmental politics is a lack of awareness or outright denial of scientific knowledge. It believes if the masses truly understood the science, then action would inevitably follow. Now, it should be obvious that this kind of knowledge politics, the belief or denial in the science, is not really speaking to the direct material concerns of the masses of working people. If anything, it can actually kind of alienate ordinary people who might not really understand the ins and outs of the greenhouse effect and climate science and all the rest of it. Very quickly, the second type of professional class environmental politics is the policy technocrat, whose expertise is more likely to be based in law or policy studies, and who work in think tanks or academia or professionalized NGOs. Since I've written the book, actually, I've become even more aware of just how deeply climate politics today is driven almost entirely by foundation-funded NGOs. And I really would recommend this article in Catalyst, which really traces the left's kind of historical shift away from mass membership organizations like parties and unions to these private, elite, top-down NGO organizations, what they call NGOism. And actually, this shift obviously parallels the decline of left, the decline of the labor movement, the decline of working class power more generally. But back to the policy technocrat type in general. This type seeks to design smart policy solutions to environmental problems. They believe they can use logic and rational policy designs to sway politicians and the public towards these kind of smart solutions. For the last few decades, these technocrats have been most convinced they can design free market policies like carbon pricing schemes that channel markets in the profit motive and allow the private sector to solve environmental problems. In the US context, and this is more shocking considering the evidence, they actually believe they can convince Republicans to support such market-friendly climate policy. Perhaps the epitome of this kind of politics is an organization I do a little case study of called the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is trying to pass a sort of flagship policy, the carbon fee and dividend, which is a kind of carbon tax that redistributes revenue to households. And to attract Republican support, they're very keen to say this carbon fee is revenue neutral. That is, it isn't going to increase government revenue or increase government spending or grow government, as Republicans would say. And almost everyone who follows the climate crisis sort of should know that actually it's going to have to involve massive increases in public spending. So this policy doesn't allow for that at all. And it's also worth pointing out that whether it's a carbon fee or a carbon tax, that these policies have been proven incredibly unpopular. A carbon tax was proposed to voters twice in 2016 and 2018 in the liberal, crunchy, green state of Washington, and it failed by substantial margins both times. A recent study shows that even including the dividend to households does not make these technocratic policy fixes that much more popular with actual voters. Yet this kind of policy advocacy persists in believing that the smartness of their own policy designs can overcome these barriers. And one of the Citizens Climate Lobby slogans, this is real, is it's time to outsmart climate change. Again, these policy technocrats are obsessed with correcting the market in the realm of exchange, but all this focus on exchange directs our attention away from the need to move to much more massively transform our systems of production and infrastructure. And this will require much more than simple market tweaks and carbon pricing. And more to the point, we've seen how masses of working class people respond to these kinds of carbon fees, carbon taxes. The Yellow Vest movement in France rose up in revolt and actually saw Macron's fuel taxes as a threat to their actual livelihoods. Now, for professional class people, the idea of raising energy prices is often attractive because they think they themselves and also everyone else really consumes too much. And a price hike would actually incentivize better behavior among the irresponsible working masses. But given that in the United States, at least 64% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck and are drowning in debt and inflation right now, it's obvious why this kind of program is antagonistic to their interests. Consequently, workers are increasingly receptive to the right-wing view that environmental policy will harm their economic lives, and it's the right in their anti-climate politics as mostly mobilized class as the reason why we don't want climate action. In 2016, Charles Koch of Koch brothers fame framed his opposition to climate policy in exactly these terms. Quote, the poorest Americans use 3 times the energy as the percentage of their income as the average American does. So climate policy is going to disproportionately hurt the poor. So Charles Koch, friend of the poor, is here. So finally, the third type of professional class climate activist is the anti-system radical, whose own exposure to the science of ecological collapse leads to a kind of political radicalization. Again, their professional class location creates this kind of context, contradictory context of relative material and economic security, and then it focuses them where they tend to want to put all the attention on the need to lessen consumption overall, or what I call a politics of less. The most popular among professionals, anyway, of this form of politics is epitomized in the degrowth movement, which, as one recent CNBC profile claims, we want to live better with less. Now, degrowth has recently been defined as, quote, a planned reduction of energy and resource use designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. Now, this sort of aggregate focus on reduction and less and degrowth, I would argue, evades the kind of class struggle approach I would advocate. Rather than just saying we need to degrow in general, a class approach would advocate degrowing the capitalist class so that we can grow a lot of things for the working class. And we actually, to solve climate change, we need to grow a lot of massive industrial infrastructure and green energy, public transit, and all the rest of it. Most importantly, working class people are going to need to see massive growth in their ability to secure the very basics of life itself, like food and housing and healthcare, which, to be fair, a lot of degrowthers would argue is part of their program to guarantee those aspects of life. The other thing about degrowth politics, though, is it tends to propose these kind of small-scale niche solutions that I would argue are not particularly popular amongst the masses. And you see a lot of this in this book on degrowth movements. This is a list from Georgios Kallis of all these different types of degrowth alternatives, sort of micro-scale, urban gardens, bike sharing, and co-ops and all the rest of it. So degrowthers are really not interested in this kind of old socialist project of transforming industrial production through class struggle, but they seek to construct these kind of smallest, beautiful micro alternatives at the local community scale. But I would argue climate change is much more of the latter type of crisis, where we actually need to kind of seize the means of industrial production and vastly transform all of industrial society on a planetary level. So one example of this kind of small scale approach to politics is a degrowth activist named Francois Schneider. His professional class as they come. He has a PhD. He's one of the founders of the research on degrowth in Paris. And he took a year-long hike around France with a donkey to talk to people about degrowth and illustrate the benefits of frugal living and, I guess, traditional animal-based mobility or energy. And I learned about this by reading a piece by Georgios Kallis, where Kallis claims that the villagers that confronted this guy were bewildered by his presence, and it's really hard to see why. The other thing I think is interesting is he kind of has the professional class outfit and aesthetic, even though he's with a donkey. Okay, so I'll let that speak for itself, but to summarize, we have 3 different kinds of professional class environmental activists: science communicators, policy technocrats, and anti-system radicals, each with its own set of slogans and theories of change. All of them avoid confronting production at a significant level, and all of them really don't have this broad mass appeal amongst the mass of the working class. And I think it's also worth noting that none of these movements are really succeeding in solving the climate crisis we face. So we actually do need a massive shift in strategy if we're going to be able to build a movement that has the power to take on some of the most powerful and wealthy corporations in world history. So finally, that is where the third class angle comes in. If we want to have any chance in building a mass movement for climate action, it's going to have to be built and have broad appeal among the majority of society, the working class, which, if you recall that Moody chart, projects as around 63% of the workforce in the United States. So again, this is largely a democratic argument. I mean, one version is a simplistic electoral argument that only through popular majorities can you actually deliver state power. And it's hard to imagine us achieving the scale and pace of changes needed for climate action without state power. This is something Christian Parenti and Andreas Malm have said very clearly. But I also want to say that it's more broad than just a simply electoral argument, that really, for socialist mass movement to succeed on a number of levels, it really just, we need mass politics. We need the masses broadly on our side. And socialist movements have historically often been about mass action and popular demands. And I would argue that the environmental movement is not really been based on this kind of mass politics for quite some time. So the first step in doing this is finding a way to counter the right-wing narrative that climate action is not in the interest of the working class. And as stated above, professional class climate politics actually often falls into and confirms this narrative. This also requires reviving some old-fashioned socialist debates on class, specifically the idea that capitalism is fundamentally structured by conflicting an objective class interest between the capitalist class and the working class. And so if the working class has material interest, can we say these interests are also ecological interests? Typically, the answer is no. Again, if saving the planet means paying carbon taxes or a politics of less, then workers are going to see climate action in terms of sacrifice and austerity. But if we go back to a kind of basic socialist definition of the working class or the proletariat as a class that's fundamentally separated from the means of production, as a class that is only really formed once it's been expelled and expropriated from the land and a secure means of livelihood rooted in the land, we can see that what defines the working class under capitalism is a fundamental insecurity in accessing the means of life itself, the means of subsistence, and that this in itself, this insecurity of life, is fundamentally an ecological form of insecurity. So actually, well, she's quite polarizing these days, but AOC herself, when asked to define democratic socialism, she simply said her definition was no one should be too poor to live. And this revival of socialist politics has really been rooted about giving people just basic secure access to the means of life. But really, in the United States today, far too many are in fact too poor to live. So again, something like 64% live paycheck to paycheck. That's probably worse now with this rapid escalation of inflation. Huge proportions struggle to afford basic things. A fifth struggle to afford food, a third struggle to afford basic utility bills, 50% struggle to afford housing, and 2/3 of United States people are really worried about paying for basic healthcare. It should be clear that the working class has a material interest in more secure access to these basics of life. And it's convenient, I think, for climate politics that these very basic working class needs, housing, energy, transportation, and food, are actually precisely the very same sectors that we need to decarbonize. If decarbonization was paired with cheaper or even free or what socialists call decommodified access to these basic needs, it would be possible to construct a more working class climate program. Now, this type of interest in climate action would have nothing to do with sacrifice or even knowledge of the climate crisis. It doesn't even require that workers really understand the greenhouse effect or the carbon cycle. It would just appeal to basic material needs. So obviously the Green New Deal, as constructed by AOC in the US, but also Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, was trying to construct precisely this type of working class climate program. And it draws not only from the New Deal history of massive public investment and expansion of government control over basic infrastructure, but also the New Deal's legacy of actually delivering material gains for masses of working people. Of course, you can point to the National Labor Relations Act and union rights, but programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Rural Electrification Administration were fundamentally about delivering electricity to poor people who did not have it. And the overwhelming focus through the construction of these massive, cheap hydroelectric power dams was to deliver cheaper and more affordable electricity to masses of poor people. And I always bring up that they hired Woody Guthrie to sing, populist songs about the river doing work for the people. And this was an incredibly inspiring mass public delivery of public goods. And it's all about energy too. So from a climate perspective, we can really learn from this history. Now, the problem, of course, is the theory of change of the Green New Deal. You actually have to deliver these material gains for working class people to actually believe in your political program. The fundamental challenge with much insurgent left politics, including Bernie Sanders's kind of class struggle presidential campaign, is the working class might agree with your program. They might think Medicare for all is a great idea, but the main barrier to winning working class support is they do not believe this kind of progressive platform is possible to pull off. They have, with Vivek Chibber, they're sort of got this resignation where they're resigned to that the rich and the powerful control everything, and that we can't actually win these massive public goods like we did in the past. In many ways, the Green New Deal and the Bernie Sanders movement really put the cart before the horse. They thought that through a political program would kind of awaken what one author has called the sleeping giant of the American working class from decades of atomization and demobilization, resignation. But history, like the 1930s, shows it's typically working class organization that comes first in the form of trade unions, strikes, and political parties. In other words, you need actual institutions that are folded into communities and everyday lives of workers themselves. And it's only these organized forms of power that can actually start to deliver the material gains and thus build confidence among the working class masses that not only that they deserve better, but that they can win better lives through struggle. Now, this brings us to the other key question of a working class strategy for climate. What should the role of unions be? Again, in the environmental movement, there's much consternation on the negative role that unions play in resisting the decarbonization agenda. The unions tend to prioritize good unionized jobs no matter what the ecological consequences. It's become a habit on the climate left to call the jobs versus environment a kind of false dilemma or a cynical tactic of the bosses. This is true to some extent, but it's also really evidence, I'd say, of the extremely underdeveloped welfare state in the United States. It is not as if neoliberal austerity offers much of a safety net to workers when coal mines shut down or power plants shut down. And again, it's this fundamental proletarian insecurity that causes workers and unions to always want to choose jobs over the environment because it's really about their only available livelihood option. Now, the standard left response to this dilemma is to shout something called just transition. The idea that displaced workers in dirty industries should be given a support to transition into new, cleaner industries. The problem, though, is that much of the fossil fuel workforce has never really heard of the just transition, and communities hollowed out by a coal mine or a power plant closure certainly don't believe that there's anything like a just transition happening for them. We shouldn't forget that the just transition idea came from a legendary union environmentalist named Tony Mazzocchi. Instead of vague assurances of retraining, Mazzocchi modeled his idea of a just transition basically over a massive expansion of the welfare state that he experienced in his life after World War II, which was called the GI Bill. The GI Bill, over nearly 3 decades, helped more than 13 million former soldiers find civilian employment or pursue educational opportunities. So rather than sloganeering, a real just transition would need to be something like that, a massive public sector expansion that actually guarantees income supports for displaced workers, guarantees free education for them. And that kind of rollout of the welfare state is what a just transition would have to really mean. A union-based climate strategy should also recognize what the labor movement has also always understood. Certain sectors of the economy are more strategic to organize in than others. Jane McAlevey recounts how really the legendary CIO organizers of the 1930s really chose to strategically focus on organizing in the steel and coal and auto industries. Today, she proposes that we should treat healthcare, education, and logistics as strategic sectors. For climate, though, it's clear that any rational pathway to 100% decarbonization goes through the electricity, through the electric sector. So the electrify everything decarbonization strategy means basically we have to clean up the electric sector and then electrify all these things that don't use electricity now, like residential heating, transportation, and industrial heat. Yet few climate or Green New Deal activists have really pointed out that the electric utility sector is one of the most unionized in the entire economy. One measure has the electric power generation, transmission, and distribution industry at about 25% union membership rate in 2020. So as Jane McAlevey would say, this could be a strategic sector to organize in for climate worried socialists. And these workers are represented by unions like the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers and the Utility Union Workers Union of America. So if the climate movement wants to get serious, it should try to win over these unions to their side in order to transform the very strategic sector that's at the core of the solution, electricity. And actually, one IBEW member has actually proposed this kind of rank and file strategy for a Green New Deal. Such a union-based climate strategy in the electricity sector would have to clearly assert one major plank that might be tough for many environmental climate activists to swallow, which from either if you're concerned about climate change or if you're concerned about unions, it's the need for nuclear power. While there's no safe climate future with coal-fired power plants in operation, the electric utility unions really highly support, whenever they're asked about climate policy, they say we need to keep nuclear clean energy open. In fact, one of the big debates over Biden's Build Back Better Act legislation was Joe Manchin's proposal, the much maligned, rightfully so, Joe Manchin's proposal to actually convert a lot of West Virginia's coal-fired power plants to nuclear power plants. And I think this idea really should not be dismissed out of hand. It would be a way to maintain thousands of good union jobs and convert centralized power plants to zero carbon power plants. And as we know, nuclear also provides reliable and not intermittent electricity like solar and wind. The debate over nuclear power is often overly technical or economistic and ignores these strategic class-centered considerations. While 100% renewables is a slogan amongst environmental NGO professionals, a pro-nuclear climate politics could actually have a chance at building larger solidarity with the actually existing electrical unions and the actual workers who know the electric system better than any of the professional class people in NGOs or academia. On the other hand, the renewable energy industries like the solar and wind energy industries are notoriously really anti-union. For solar photovoltaic energy, it's 4% union density. For concentrated solar and wind energy, it's about 6%. Plus, both sectors are run almost entirely for profit by private capital. So instead of really obsessing and fixating on solar and wind, the climate movement should engage with electricity unions, arguing that unless these unions actually develop a long-term strategy to center unions in the green transition, that the unions and their members are going to be destroyed and swept away by a sort of cutthroat form of green renewable capitalism. an anti-union form of capitalism. Okay, I think this has gone much longer than I planned. So I'm going to conclude. There's one last motto of traditional working class politics that we should talk about: internationalism. The famous socialist anthem, the Internationale, really claimed in the lyrics, at least the British lyrics, to unite the human race. It was not only a central aspect of socialist politics that the working class had these objective material interests, but it also asserted that the proletariat or working class was the so-called last class, the class with the capacity to actually abolish class rule itself for the first time in human history and deliver human emancipation and freedom. Now, in the face of the prospect of human extinction and planetary ruin, we need a kind of new kind of ecological internationalism that is also rooted in human emancipation and what I call in the book species solidarity. While ecological politics often points toward reuniting local communities with local ecologies, or returning to the land, or localizing agriculture or food networks, a proletarian ecological internationalism would have to be planetary in scope. And again, Marx and others believe that, in fact, what happened to the working class was that they were torn from the land, from localities, and that they were torn from any kind of direct local, parochial, or community concern. And that's what made the working class the so-called universal class. And that class had the capacity to really unite and emancipate humanity as a whole. So solving climate change really means nothing less than revolutionizing energy production at a global level. And while most debates over decarbonization really focus narrowly on how we're going to accomplish this technologically with renewables or battery storage or carbon capture or nuclear, whatever it is, it's clear that we really have to think about humanity and human liberation in this process as well. And in fact, we need to really recognize the fundamental human right to energy itself. And some organizers have talked about how we need to start to deliver electricity as a human right to masses of people who still do not have access to basic electricity. Even in this country, utility shutoffs lead to death and horrible consequences. The energy analyst Robert Bryce did some calculations to reveal that his refrigerator consumes about 1,000 kilowatt hours per year, and this is more than the annual consumption of about 3.3 billion people on the planet. So there's this incredible project we need to do about, again, kind of like that New Deal, delivering energy to the masses. And if we can deliver that in decarbonized form, this can be a positive, emancipating process of working class liberation. And so finally, Lenin, whose revolutionary project took place in a rural country where many lacked access to basic modern amenities, he famously said that communism is Soviet or worker power plus electrification of the whole country. Now we need to kind of resurrect that kind of vision for working class emancipation. We need to sort of, say eco-socialism is worker power plus electrification of the whole planet, right? And that's this kind of broad, positive vision of working class emancipation is what we really need to stave off climate disaster. So I will end there and thank you so much and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Matt. I think I will start off with the point you left off, which is internationalism. And so one of the things, I think I've read like the introduction of your book and listened to like a couple of interviews and podcasts, and also like, of course, also this talk. And one of the things that came to my mind was, okay, you want to connect direct material gains in terms of living standards with basically, okay, environmentally, how to call it, like decarbonization strategy of, okay, giving people, like, for example, more access to energy. And you also say in the beginning of the book, okay, the focus of the book is quite clearly the US. And so last week we had Troy Vitisi and Drew Pendergrass on, who also who published recently the Half of Socialism book, also by Verso. And one of their main points is basically to say, okay, this lifting up of living standards, especially in terms of energy usage. If you look at it on like a global scale and say, okay, like take for example, like, okay, US working class, and you say the US working class needs more access to energy, for example, right, or more reliable access to energy, whatever. And then you would like project that onto like a global scale, that their point is simply that, okay, given the technologies we have, this is simply not possible in like any environmentally sustainable way. And my question was that, okay, maybe this focusing on the US might cause some blind spots in terms of trade-offs that like, yeah, and that's my question, like part one. And you say that, okay, you focus on the US because the US is a strategic vantage point, like, and I completely agree. But the question is, okay, how would you say, should we deal in terms of like research and strategizing with this? We need to focus on specific areas, but also need to, how do we avoid blind spots when we only focus on them? That's, I know it's a big, complicated question, but I think it's quite integral.
Yeah. So I will freely admit that the book's probably the major flaw of the book is its US focus, because obviously climate change is a global crisis, and we need to figure out a way to come together as a global community to solve it. So I'm in a bit of a pickle as someone who's, I'm a geographer, but I'm even more probably embedded in what's often called, you know, American studies, and I'm a student of US politics, and that's kind of my wheelhouse. And as I say in the book, I think it's clear that if you know, the US political situation is a nut we have to crack if we want to solve climate change. So it's not a real sufficient reason for only focusing on the US, but I try to say that if we can build a kind of winning climate politics in the US, it would really have global repercussions that would be significant. Because even recently with Biden in power, I mean, the US is the biggest barrier to international climate action and significant climate cooperation amongst the international community. So I want to withhold saying too much, because I'm in the middle of reading Half Earth Socialism. I'm finding it super interesting, to be honest. And there's apparently going to be a panel event where we kind of exchange some ideas. So I don't want to kind of give away some of my thoughts, but I'll say one thing, that overall, I think like you said, like they kind of make these assertions that, you know, it's not possible to do X, that there's these limits, that there's these planetary boundaries. And they, you know, they have these sort of what they claim are kind of scientifically worked out kind of schemes where they say, you know, what would be sustainable is everyone gets 2000 watts, right? It's a 2000 watt society. And what I would say is that just doesn't, as a Marxist, like that's not how I think Marxists should think about technology and think about energy and think about history, because from a Marxist perspective, nothing is fixed or there aren't these core limits, but that through you know, development of the productive forces, we can figure out ways to deal in different ways with these limits. So I obviously there are serious ecological crises that we're facing, but I don't think we can say outright that this is how much energy every person can get for all of time. Like technology changes. We can, there are tons of clean energy technologies that have not even been fully utilized yet. And if we were to make breakthroughs in certain technologies, it would totally change both you know, the land use requirements of energy systems, the thermodynamic requirements. You know, the half-earth socialism, they sort of assume like our only option is 100% renewable solar and wind, and then from that assumption, yeah, there's some serious limits, particularly in land use. You know, we'd have to just paper over the planet with solar panels and wind term. But there are other clean energy options that can be coupled with those renewables that use less land, like nuclear. And you know, someday, perhaps if we ever figured out fusion power, I mean, then all these limits are just completely gone, right? So nothing in history is fixed. Technology, as we've seen actually, and in the energy, I started studying oil in 2004, and everyone was talking about peak oils here, and we have these limits, and all of society is going to collapse. And then they figured out fracking, and then by 2014 there was a massive oversupply of oil on the market. And so what Marxists want to do is say this technology is dynamic, and we want to control it and harness it for human liberation, human ends. And so that's what I think a Marxist project should be about: taking social public worker control over the decarbonization process, harnessing this clean energy revolution toward human need and planetary stability. And I would not want to put limits on that. I would want to say socialists should be free to figure out the best way to do that. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, I know that a lot of people are going to say that, okay, that sounds good, but, you know, Americans need to consume less energy. Like, that's like a definitive statement that has to happen. I just think that's, you know, when you look at the stat I showed, a third of Americans struggle to pay their energy bills. Those Americans are already struggling to afford their basic energy needs. They don't need to be told to consume less. They're already trying, right? They're trying to be more efficient and cut down on energy use. Again, you know, it's all about the technology. If we are able to decarbonize and clean up the energy system, it's not clear that you need to, you know, the Americans must consume less narrative even works. I have a friend who lives in Quebec, and in Quebec, they have massive, cheap hydropower for everyone. And she jokes that everyone has like electric heating, which is the most inefficient form, like not heat pumps, mind you, like baseboard, super inefficient electric heating. And they all just don't even think about it because they have so much cheap hydro. So again, I'm hesitant to place fixed limits on what we can do and what we can't do. What socialists should want to do is try to take control over these energy systems to harness them toward social need and staving off climate disaster. And obviously we'll face limits in that process, but I don't want to assert what those limits are from the start.
Maybe like I would be super interested in, because in asking, okay, basically what is the kind of methodology, what is the way we arrive at an answer to this question, to this, okay, hey, are there these limits, or like is how to say that, how can we use, I don't know how to formulate it really well, maybe yeah, I'm sorry, but we have a question from the audience actually. Okay. Maybe I'll come back when I have like a good formulation. The question from the audience is, from Max Cohen, how does ecological unequal exchange factor into your analysis? For example, renewable energy systems are manufactured through net transfer of energy, land, resources, labor from peripheries to cores.
Another book I'm working my way through is this book called The Imperial Form of Living, which uses this kind of theory that has I think has its roots really in kind of an old kind of world systems analysis that kind of talks about how originally they talk about how surplus value is really drained from the periphery, and then people use that theory of unequal exchange to kind of talk about how this is also an ecologically unequal exchange. I think that is, you know, a serious problem, but the main problem I see is that the renewable energy industry is run by private capital and they're running it for profit. So they're going to want to link up with supply chains in the global south that are also seeking profit and seeking to externalize ecological costs to make the most money. And essentially the problem on both ends of those commodity chains is that capital is going to not care about the environment and want to seek profit. And so the answer to that is to try to build a counterpower to those capitalists, whether they're the renewable capitalists setting up wind farms and solar panels in the global north, or the lithium mining capitalists setting up mines in the global south, or cobalt mines with slave labor in the Congo. You know, we need to find ways to build working class union power on those supply chains to counter the power of the capitalists. And if you actually look at mining operations that do have high levels of union density and working class power, you find that there's going to be less environmental damage and less human damage to the workers themselves. And so unfortunately, I think the ecological unequal exchange argument often acts as if there's this flow of use values from the global south to the working classes of the global north who are appropriating these use values, and they are the ones benefiting, which in a use value sense is correct, but my analysis would much more want to focus on the flows of money in these networks and the owners of these supply chains, and they're the ones appropriating the profits from these ecological flows, and we really need to tackle their power first. And I think to tackle their power, we actually need to not talk about how the global north is imperialist because of the way they live. We need to talk about uniting working classes in the global north who have faced decades of austerity and attacks on their living standards with working classes of the global south who are also fighting for better lives against these capitalists who are controlling the supply chains down there. So I'm not too attracted to this idea of this imperial mode of living, because I think it takes the attention away from the owners and the profiteers of these systems and focuses on ordinary people just living their lives, appropriating use values with their wages. And that's not, to me, the real cause of these problems. It's capital.
Thank you. Another question I had in mind with these, the ecological theory of class, as you put it, and then the point of, okay, there are strategic sectors that we basically have to concentrate on for union organizing to win over like an actually happening decarbonization, which at the same time also builds worker power and maybe not brings us to socialism, but at least like brings us to a better point on the road towards that. So makes it more likely to happen down the road. And so you have like the capitalist class, the PMC, so to say, and then the working class. And I wanted to ask if, and you say, okay, the PMC and the working class do have significant different relations to the means of production. Like the working class are actually the people who are involved in production, and therefore have like this ecological key position, whereas the PMC doesn't really have that. And I want to ask if you say, okay, does that mean that, okay, we base that all of the working class, so to say, because they have this key position to production, does have to be also the focus of union organizing? Or do you think, okay, there are specific sectors in the working class which don't like derive from the position of working class itself, but just very specific ones, which are strategically the most important ones?
So the argument kind of has two planks to it. One is the broad kind of working class, which is that, you know, like, let's estimate 65% of society. And I would say a lot of those people are not in production. Actually, they're in services. They're doing care work and cleaning and food service and all this kind of stuff. So there's an argument that we need to appeal to this broad mass, right? And that's where the Green New Deal comes in. That's where kind of you were talking earlier, like these material gains and improvements. But then there's the question of how do you actually build working power, union and working class power in the sectors we need to transform for climate change. And that's where a focus on, I think we really should focus on these heavily unionized electric utilities that already have the infrastructures of unions, which have tremendous resources. They have institutional power. They're there. Unfortunately, for a lot of the climate left, because those unions have tended to be conservative and tended to be aligned with the capitalist utilities, a lot of the climate left has just sort of written them off as problematic. Some of them might even be Trump supporters, right? So I don't think we can write them off. Like we have to actually think strategically that these unions are a base of power in the very system we need to transform. Now, what I'd also like to say is that the question of either of these strategies, I think, should have a place for the professional class in both of them. I did a lot of reading on the PMC stuff, and one stuff that really stuck with me is actually a Marxist, Nikos Poulantzas. He theorized what we call the PMC. He called them the new petty bourgeoisie, and he really focused on how the new petty bourgeoisie was really focused on mental work, what we call knowledge work. But he argued that this sort of knowledge worker class, this new petty bourgeoisie, had kind of they could have a contradictory form of politics that could either be proletarian or bourgeois, right? And it depend on historical struggles and conditions over which side this class would align with, the proletarian side or the bourgeois side. And so what I'm arguing in the book is that for under neoliberalism, part of its power is that this professional class is aligned more with a bourgeois politics that helps the capitalist class, right? But that doesn't have to be the case. And the professional class could and already does. Like there was a huge class of professional class people supporting the Bernie Sanders movement, supporting like union organizing right now in Starbucks and Amazon, whatever. So that's what we actually want to build, this kind of alliance, this mass alliance between proletarianly inclined professional class people. But the other thing I'd point out is that if we think the electric utilities are the strategic sector, we also have to admit that a lot of those unions and a lot of those workers are actually professional class. They are highly knowledgeable, highly trained engineers and electrical technicians who are in these unions, right? And so, but there's also probably in those unions, the high school educated, more manual workers in these plants and on the lines and things like this. So even in the unions themselves, you're going to have to figure out how to make this kind of proletarian alliance between the manual workers and the knowledge workers and the professional workers, and that's going to be actually a challenge. So yeah, I think it's about actually forming those alliances where they make sense that we need to think about.
That would have been my next question about like, okay, is there a potential alliance of, okay, and how could that basically look like? And maybe to get into some extent, I guess you've read Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. Like it fit, yeah, okay, perfect. It fits perfectly in here. And my impression always was, okay, this is a great book, but it lacks one thing, and it lacks this like, okay, what basically all of leftist climate literature, or like a lot of leftist climate stuff has been focusing on, which is, okay, we need this like mass movement aspect, and that's like completely missing out of his vision. But
right.
I wanted to ask, like, what do you think about kind of like the narrative that's presented in Ministry for the Future, and if we would like add actually, okay, like a vibrant climate and social workers movement into this, if that is like a vision that you would think, okay, this is kind of like what we need, because there is like this, okay, alliance with the PMC in the novel, kind of.
Oh yeah. To me, it was kind of like a dramatization of like technocrats trying to save the earth, right? And you get these technocrats that are in the high levels of basically monetary policy, and they try to, set up this carbon coin system that would really accelerate a clean energy transition. And it's really a dramatic story of this kind of technocratic climate fix, not to mention the geoengineering part of it. But I would say it's a story of kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, top-down climate solutions, or basically top-down kind of responses and attempts to grapple with an accelerating climate disaster. And yeah, the idea that there could be a mass movement to solve it is missing. But you could say, to be fair to KSR, is that what his novel represents is what has been true, which is that there hasn't been a movement. And that's kind of what I start the book with, is that we need to be serious that we're not winning this. We're not building this movement. We need to think differently about how we might. And if you're being serious and you're being realistic, you probably have to admit that the likelihood of building this mass movement is not super high in the coming decades. So the scenario that is in the book of just cascading disaster amidst top-down technocratic and state-led attempts to solve it, alongside like minoritarian violent terrorist factions trying to spread awareness and push change in this, I guess, like Blanquiist kind of strategy. I guess that's like actually a pretty realistic vision, unfortunately. But it's also, as the book shows, it's I think, not to spoil anything, but I think the book, it's kind of weird how at the end it's like, and then like climate started getting better and everyone figured it out. I think that's less likely unless we're able to build kind of mass power in the way I describe. I would say it'd be more likely that things just cascade and get worse if we aren't able to do that.
It's maybe interesting. I don't remember that well, but if there is like a significant eco-fascist faction in the book or not, because like it seems kind of likely that would develop in the scenario of just, okay,
yeah,
cascading catastrophes, like waves of migrants, etc. And
right.
yeah, okay, maybe as a last question, and I think to kind of like locate your book in kind of like the, for lack of a better word, ecology of like socialist research on climate movements, climate strategy, and would be, what do you think your book does and where are its limits? So what do you think, what complementary research would you like to see that takes off where you've left with the book? And yes.
That's a good question. For one, I'd love to see a lot more research on these unions that are in the electric sector, because like I said, I think a lot of times those unions are written off as just problematic. And I think it's obviously more complicated than that, and trying to actually do the type of deep qualitative research to actually learn how people in these sectors think and what they themselves think about the climate crisis, and do they see themselves as having strategic role in accelerating a clean transition? And if not, like is there any scenario where they might? As it happens, I have a lot of grad students working with me who are kind of grappling with these very questions here at Syracuse. So I think they're going to do brilliant work on this.
Just shortly, do you think that maybe something like that could be like a possible alliance where you say, okay, you have like the PMC part, and the PMC does work that's actually like making the work of actual organizers easier. So there's like a strategic alliance between these two. Do you think that like that would be an example?
Yeah, and one thing I draw in the book is kind of this kind of theory of change in unions called the rank and file strategy that was developed by Kim Moody and has been translated in ways that now the organization in the US called Labor Notes is really basically they have basically a strategy for how to build radical militant unions from within and to kind of get activist labor organizers to join unions, not just to get a union job, but to actually become activists within their unions and to try to build a more democratic mass form of power within these unions. And so you see that work has actually paid dividends in the last 2 years in the basically United Auto Workers. These radical union members were able to fight a campaign that has radically democratized those unions so that each member now gets a vote on various things. There's an organization called Teamsters for a Democratic Union that are doing the same thing, and they've had some significant gains in the last election, and they're trying to get involved in this Amazon organizing stuff. And the Amazon labor victory was like a classic example of what Labor Notes would say, where you have these just committed militant minority of organizers in the union that are just having conversations with their coworkers and radicalizing them on the exploitation they're facing and getting them to want change and to believe change is possible against the bosses. And also sometimes against the trade union leadership, right? Because sometimes they're as aligned with the bosses as you wouldn't want that, right? So you have to challenge what they call business unionism. You actually have to build mass movements within the unions amongst the rank and file members. And Joe Burns has a new book called Class Struggle Unionism. And so this was all to answer your question. I think sometimes the people who are doing this kind of rank and file strategy are sometimes called salting. They're actually getting these union jobs. They actually are, a lot of these people are what we would call PMC. They are college educated people that have these credentials, but yet decide that for their life, for their career, what they want to do is get into unions and radicalize unions and build the labor movement in their unions. And so I think there's a role for PMC to play in that process if they're willing. There's a, it's a lot to ask someone to, like, for their lives, get these union jobs and do the hard work of labor organizing, in addition to the hard work of like doing something like working in an Amazon warehouse, which is just soul crushing and horrific work. So it's a lot to ask, but I think more and more activists and socialists, and particularly in the US, are actually getting excited to like do that kind of rank and file work. And I think that's exciting.
Maybe the second part of my last question with the complementary research that you would, or was it like you mentioned the work that you're doing with your grad students, but like maybe something else you might come up with, maybe also in case with like the point about internationalism, like your focus on the US. How would research look like that would complement your book, for example?
So you could think about doing research on the other, again, I have that kind of two kind of planks of the working class strategy, the union one, but there's also the broad Green New Deal one that's supposed to appeal to the masses of workers. I have to admit that a lot of what I'm doing is kind of assuming that workers would be responsive to, or particularly economically insecure working class people would be responsive to things like cheaper electricity, public housing, Medicare for all. I think there's a lot of like just straight up survey research and opinion research that needs to be done to actually get a sense of what the ordinary people think about those types of public goods proposals. And there was a great study recently by Jacobin and what is, I think, called the Center for Working Class Studies, where they just did a massive survey research of working class people to just sort of figure out like what kind of political messages do they respond well to from particular types of political candidates. And they were trying to understand how the left can kind of win elections better and appeal to working class voters better. But they could totally do that kind of study on climate issues and try to understand like what types of messaging do working class people, particularly like the 2/3 of Americans that don't have college degrees, like what kind of climate messaging would they respond to? What kind of climate policies would they be supportive of? I think there's so much actual empirical work that could be done there. It would be really helpful.
It's maybe also in like doing actual empirical work versus, okay, dominating in the humanities, like putting buzzword Anthropocene here, putting buzzword Anthropocene there, and call it a day. And like a whole industry has sprung up around that, and
Sure.
it's helping basically nobody.
Yeah.
Yeah. Way too familiar with that.
Yeah.
Okay, Matt, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Like, just excuse the technical difficulties in the beginning.
No problem.
And I'm super excited, and I think a lot of other people are, for the Versa panel. And I hope it's going to be a productive discussion. I think there's like, there's like this unique chance of, okay, these three different books will all have their quite specific approach coming out in like a very condensed time. So
right,
especially for people who are quite new to this, it's like, okay, you get like a quite good overview of like dominant or like possible approaches, and maybe make up your mind and like, okay, hey, maybe push each other on blind spots, on etc. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Supposedly we're going to do it on June 9th, so mark your calendar.
Okay.
And it will be streamed and recorded, and it'll be available forever, hopefully. So
perfect. Just as this is.
Right.
Until the end of time.
It makes me nervous, but yeah.
Okay. Hey, then have a good day, and
you too.
Everybody who watched, thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you so much for having me.